Welcome to this week's episode of Weekly Hope. I'm Kirsten Hagland. It's great to have you here. Of course, we've got my unofficial co-host of the show, Elsa, here as well. She says hello. If you caught my post on Instagram stories earlier, a little preview as to our guest and what our show is going to look like today, I let you know that Elsa really needed a bath earlier today, and she's all clean and ready to go. So thankful that you're here. So what we do at Weekly Hope, just to give you a little picture, a window into the show, if this is your first time joining us, is we try to bring on clinicians, experts, advocates, people with recovery stories from the wide spectrum of eating disorder experiences and bring them on here so that you can ask them questions. We can get an inside look into what they do. And of course, with the end goal being providing hope and resources and education and just a safe place to be, learn more about eating disorder treatment, recovery, and hopefully leave here inspired. So that's what we do. If you're coming back, welcome back to the show. And of course, if you find this video something that you're like, hey, this is super helpful for me, or something that is really positive for me in my journey, then we've got all of our previous Weekly Hope episodes on our Facebook page, on the videos, in the videos section, as well as on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go check out earlier episodes as well and see a variety of different topics, you can feel free to do that. So just a reminder as well, throughout the broadcast, we want to hear from you. So please sign into the comments, let us know your name, where you're signing in from, your thoughts and feelings that may come up, and of course, any questions, because we've got a really interesting show today and something different than what we've done before, and want to make sure that we're hearing from you, what's on your mind, and of course, give you the opportunity to ask questions of this really, really world-class expert that we have on today. So without further ado, we will dive right into our topic. Today we're discussing a complex web of addictions and co-occurring disorders, because eating disorders do not exist in a vacuum. And we wanted to bring on one of the leading experts in addictions to talk about the intersection and interplay of these things and what we can be on the lookout for if we have a loved one who may be struggling with one or more of these issues. So Sarah Logan says, hi, I'm Sarah from Texas, but live in Nevada. Well, hey, Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. All right, so want to bring in our guest, Dr. Mark Gold. There he is joining us on the other side of the screen. And just to let you know a little bit about Dr. Gold, he has an extensive background in bio, but his current position is professor, an adjunct professor at Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine at the Department of Psychiatry. He also has an illustrious background. He's the chairman of Rivermend Health's Scientific Advisory Boards, chairman of the Addiction and Psychiatry Scientific Advisory Board, and also chairman of the Eating Disorders and Obesity Scientific Advisory Board, among many other distinguished honors. So we are really, really super lucky to have the expert in town. So thank you, Dr. Gold.
Thank you. It's fun to be here.
Thank you. It's
experts like me, so I'm glad to be let out.
Absolutely. So we're going to just jump right in here. So obviously, Eating Disorder Hope is a site, a resource portal for people struggling with eating disorders. But as I mentioned in the intro, you know, these things don't occur in a vacuum. And oftentimes people who are struggling go to treatment and there are comorbidities or co-occurring disorders. So can you, and those can be two kind of big words for people outside of the medical community or the mental health community. So can you just start by giving us a really basic look at what is a comorbidity or a co-occurring disorder?
So if you were to look at co-occurring disorders, you'd say, well, you'd have co-occurring psychiatric disorders. So when we talk about anorexia nervosa, we often talk about obsessive compulsive disease, or at least obsessive compulsive personality features as a co-occurring disorder. When we talk about anorexia nervosa, we might also talk about the effects of starvation, and they could cause co-occurring disorders from brain changes to actual cortical shrinking to liver changes and kidney crisis and electrolyte imbalance. Those would all be co-occurring disorders. So when we think about a disorder like anorexia, we have to look at the whole patient and say, what are the psychiatric disorders? What are the occurring drug abuse disorders, if any? What are the co-occurring personality? What's the family context? What's the history and genetics? And also keep in our mind the neurological, endocrinological, and medical co-occurring disorders. It's very complicated, and that's good because it just shows that research has been making progress. It's not just a labeling. What does the DSM-5 say? It's trying to find out all of the various things that could compromise a person's health, their survival, and ultimately what we need to do to help them with their recovery.
Right. And I wonder because I hear so much when people go into treatment, like, for example, maybe they are, someone intervenes, a loved one intervenes on what they think is an addiction to alcohol or an addiction to prescription drugs or something else. And then they get into treatment and that they really are struggling with anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa. There's something underneath that. And so far as treatment goes, what is better? Is it better to go treat one thing and then another, or to do it all together? And especially from the standpoint of the brain, what does the brain need?
That's a really good question, and oftentimes we don't have an exact answer. In addiction, we know that if a person has a primary addiction and also has co-occurring depression, that if you treat them both, the patient and the family and the recovery all do better. So that we know, like if you have, in the old days, they used to say, if you were an alcoholic, we can deal with your cigarette smoking later. And they only, after a while, did we find out that the number one cause of death among recovering alcoholics was tobacco-related disease. So clearly, that's not a good idea. And the same thing would apply to people who have an eating disorder. Clearly, we have a whole role of rehydration and refeeding and general health and care. But at the same time, if there's a significant co-occurring obsessive compulsive disease, something more than perfectionism, that's important that we have CBT and DBT and other treatments available so that they just don't get rehydrated and leave. Almost, you have to kind of think of that. The analogy in addiction would be like detox. If you just detoxify an addict, they will almost always relapse. If you just, rehydrate someone or bring their electrolytes into balance, they're going to relapse, in my opinion. So I do think it's better to have a whole patient evaluation. It's better to have a whole patient and family intervention and treatment plan. And it's better to see all the dimensions recover to the point that the patient could be managed in a less intensive environment, outpatient environment, for example.
Yeah. What are some of the most common comorbidities with anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa?
So this is kind of an interesting question, and the science is changing. So, as you alluded to, my career has been in science. So I probably had my first publication in eating disorders in the 1970s, and I worked on hormone regulation and loss of menstrual cycle regularity and rhythm in anorexia very early on. So you have, well, we have a DSM-5 now, and that's much improved over the previous versions. We have some people develop anorexia at a very early age. One clear predictive factor is going to be what's the early body mass index, and do we have a clue? So some people will be lucky and they're underweight and their body mass index brings them to attention, and they get outpatient psychotherapy and family counseling, and they never come to medical attention. So we do have partly it'll be co-occurring, but the co-occurring might be explained because of genetic overlap. So in the journal Science, which is a journal that I read, it's a very important journal. They looking at genes, they would say, well, gee, anorexia nervosa is an illness that co-occurs with lots of other psychiatric diseases, that it's more commonly associated with psychiatric diseases than many other diseases. So obsessive compulsive disease comes to mind, anorexia nervosa comes to mind, trauma and trauma-related consequences and co-occurrence come to mind. They're all comorbid and co-occurring psychiatric diseases to pay attention to. In bulimia nervosa, while more common, it has different genetics. It has different DSM-5 characteristics, and the genetic analyses don't show the same sort of thing as we see for anorexia nervosa, where the UNC group has done such great and pioneering work. So I think in bulimia nervosa is much more complicated. There's more to be learned, but we do see a lot of substance misuse and substance dependence in bulimia nervosa, and much, much less so in anorexia nervosa. In both, we see depression and we see some suicidal thinking and plan, and sometimes suicidal attempts. But bulimia nervosa has the most in the way of co-occurring substance use disorders, oftentimes cocaine and psychostimulants, other times alcohol, sometimes binge use and loss of control, and many behavioral, we call behavioral addictions, can be seen as co-occurring disorders.
Yeah. Can you just, before I move on to the next question, can you just briefly explain what is a behavioral addiction?
Yeah. So it used to be thought that you couldn't be addicted to anything that didn't give you a pronounced withdrawal syndrome. So the examples that were used of addicting drugs when I started in this field in the 1970s, yeah, that's a long time ago. They used to say, yeah, that you had to have a withdrawal syndrome or it couldn't be addicting. So the DSM-1, the DSM-2, and the DSM-3 agreed that the addicting drugs were led by drugs like alcohol, sedative, hypnotic, sleeping pills, and opioids, because they cause such dramatic withdrawal syndromes. And really, up to that time, they didn't consider cocaine addicting. Some of my basic science work proved that cocaine, yeah, I know. It was our work in 84 and 85 that proved that cocaine was addicting. And after that, the DSM reorganized and said, well, withdrawal wasn't really that important. What's important is attachment, repeat use, loss of control, damage on the basis of use, continued use despite adverse consequences. And so things that were not thought of as addicting, like cocaine, to lead with. And then after that, gambling. And after that, video gaming. After that, food, sugar, sex. Those kinds of what we used to call in the old days process addictions are now considered by the American Psychiatric Association as behavioral addictions.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you. That was really, really helpful, because I've heard them called process addictions before. And, I think people have heard maybe about gambling or shopping addiction or some of these other things, but that are being thrown around a lot more and talked about a lot more now. So I just wanted to get that clarification. That was really helpful. Just quickly, I just bring in. Oh, okay. Sorry. I just wanted to bring in this comment. Jacqueline says, hello. Jacqueline Ekron here. Such an honor to have Dr. Mark Gold share his insights with us today. Thanks, Jacqueline. And then also the Kirsten Haglund Foundation says hello. I'm pretty sure that's my mom. So, hey, Mom. Thanks so much for watching. And then actually just would like to get you, Sarah Logan actually writes, is it normal to have suicide thoughts with an eating disorder? I think that's the question. How common are suicidal thoughts with eating disorders?
So I really have to look at the most current literature, but the I would say for it's a complex interaction between shame and guilt and the kinds of things that could be handled in psychotherapy and family work, and the co-occurrence of common genetic risks of a very strong major depressive disease. So in anorexia nervosa, that would be the most common, but we do see a lot of impulsivity and loss of control in bulimia nervosa. In binge eating disorder, that would be more uncommon. But while we're not talking about obesity, obesity also has associated with it depression and suicidal thinking. So my advice would be not to rely on whether it's a 20% co-occurrence. That wouldn't matter if you're a parent or a person with an eating disorder. What would matter is that you did at least a quick assessment. Those can be available online. They tend to be questions that are readily answered. And if you're in any kind of a group that qualifies for depression treatment, keep in mind that there are many treatments that are not medications. So you have CBT, you have psychotherapy, you have other kinds of treatment, and even in the biological treatment realm, there's now transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is not a medicine and is not shock treatments. It's just magnetic pulses that attempt to reset your brain's pleasure and reinforcement system.
Yeah, that is a really, really fascinating technology. We'll have to have you on for another Facebook Live to talk about that, because that is really fascinating. You've mentioned this a few times, and I would love to get your thoughts on it, because I've heard a lot of questions about this, and I myself don't know exactly. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between binge eating disorder, or BED, and food addiction? Are they two very separate things? Do they share some similarities? What is the proper way to think about this?
So that's a great question. I love answering it. And I 2 weeks ago, I spent a good part of the morning in Cincinnati and visited with Susan McElroy. And so the binge eating disorder is a very good example of how the DSM works and what are its strengths. So you just simply go to the DSM-5 or simply Google binge eating disorder as a checklist. But what makes binge eating disorder different than food addiction is there's a specific treatment for it, lisdexamfetamine. So the idea that you have a specific treatment kind of helps confirm that, yes, it's more along the spectrum of an attention deficit disorder. It's more around presence of eating and mindfulness. It's a specific disease where you eat more than you intended. You're guilty about it. You kind of eat in great binges, not realizing how much you ate. You eat past fullness, and there's a specific treatment in a way. So I do really think that because people who have BED can be identified quickly, that there's a treatment or treatments, psychosocial and medication, which have proven safe and effective and approved by the FDA. That's distinct. So now food addiction was a concept, and it's operationally defined not by the DSM-5, but by the Yale Food Addiction Scale. Again, you can go to the internet, you can download it. Two mentees of mine have kind of pioneered this concept. That's Nicole Avena and Ashley Gearhart. Nicole was at Princeton when I was working with Bart Hubble there, and Ashley was Kelly Brownell at Yale when we were collaborating. And we wrote a book together, Kelly Brownell and I, the Food and Addiction book. But the Yale Food Addiction Scale is easy to use. It's been correlated with brain imaging. It's available in many forms, in languages, other languages. And so once a patient is identified, the question is how much overlap there is with with BED. There is some overlap. There's not as much as you think. And the main treatment outcome that has been suggested to be more predictive is actually bariatric surgery for food addiction. Yeah, it's very interesting. We've used addiction medicine treatments in food addiction with some success, but that's still a work in progress.
Interesting. This is a random question, but I've heard it so many times that I just have to ask you. I've heard it said, there's this war on sugar and war on obesity. And, on the one hand, of course, as a health professional yourself, I'm sure, yes, we all want to be healthier and see our children grow up to be healthier in every sense of the word. But at the same time, there's so much alarmism around diets and the next fad diet and the next thing that's evil, like fat was evil for a long time. Now it's sugar. I've heard some people say that sugar is more addictive than crack cocaine. Is this a myth? What's going on with this?
Yeah, that was really out there. I had a slide like this in one of my academic presentations, but it's not even close. All
right, good.
Like the way you define this as a researcher, and I'll just say I have about 1,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers, but the way you define this is you take an animal, you hook it up to an IV, you give it a telegraph key, and you let it hit the key for the drug. It gets a drug every time it hits the key. So if you do that, cocaine is the most addicting drug, and almost always use leads to death because you have very quick loss of control. For opioids, closely follows that. And, drugs of abuse are all, by definition, self-administered by lab animals and man. For sugar, our group work at Princeton and work before me had shown, Nicole Avena and Bart Hubble, that animals would self-administer sugar, but they wouldn't self-administer to death. They did have binge use, but at the same time, so did fructose corn syrup self-administering animals. But the difference, interesting enough, was the sugar animals didn't gain very much weight, and the fructose corn syrup animals gained a lot of weight, and the sugar animals kept going on their treadmills and little bars and stuff, and the fructose animals mostly just sat around. So, I think the core concept is that, like caffeine, sugar, when added to foods, becomes more likely to be self-administered, more likely to be liked, more likely to be craved or wanted, and more successful as a brand for food sales. So it helps food sales to have caffeine in liquid products or to have sugar. And the same will be the case when cannabis-related products are added to food. It just makes them more likely to be self-administered, more likely to be wanted. So tomato sauce without sugar is less interesting to consumers than tomato sauce with sugar, or orange juice without sugar, and so forth and so on. So, but sugar is important to pay attention to because we consume more than we need. It is a cause of overeating and loss of control over food, and it is at the same time an essential additive for food sales to promote more eating than we need. So people have rightly said sugar causes type 2 diabetes, sugar causes fatty liver, but it's really the eating that's causing it, in my opinion. But at higher doses, sugar itself can be toxic, and Lustig has taken on that cause. But at the same time, some other natural sugars may be protective, and there's a recent study like this week from researchers showing that some natural sugars are protective. So I wouldn't want to lump them all together, but I would say that artificial sugars are not generally a great idea in the same way that more natural is better.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Thank you for that. Super
Like,
helpful.
yeah, I mean, I think like on the bulimia question you said, I think that the common comorbidities to just focus on would be, like I said, alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs, depression. I think that's really the biggest of the psychiatric comorbidities. You do have the risk of weight gain, and you do have fluid and electrolyte disturbances and cardiac abnormalities. Those would be the medical comorbidities that we'd see with bulimia nervosa.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've kind of segued into talking about some of these addictive substances and that can occur with people who have eating disorders. And it actually leads us to a really important conversation, and that is regarding overdose. And this Friday, actually, in 2 days, is International Overdose Awareness Day. So Friday, August 31st. And there is a really great social media campaign going on to raise awareness of this, try to decrease stigma. And actually, Dr. Gold, you can contribute at a really wonderful addiction.com, which is a sister site, in light of Demi Lovato's recent tragic overdose, and talked about the signs and symptoms, as well as how her life was saved because of Narcan. So let's talk a little bit about overdose, what its signs are, what people can do about it. But before we go there, I'd like to get your comments and thoughts on this recent New York Times article, August 15th, so just last week, about the new estimates from the Centers for Disease Control that say that they're estimating, the CDC's estimating for last year, drug overdoses killed about 72,000 Americans, a record number reflecting a rise of about 10%. The death toll is higher than the peak yearly death totals from HIV, car crashes, or gun deaths. So this is, and this is not just opioids. This is heroin, cocaine, and other drugs that you didn't see necessarily 4 years ago. Why is this such a skyrocketing problem? And can you give us some kind of hope that we're going to start to see some positive movement here?
So this is a very complicated question. I can count on you.
I know. Sorry.
But so let's just go back and say, do we really have an opioid crisis? Yes. We have a crisis of overdose reversal, death, and opioid use disorder. They are dealt with separately in our health system, and but the common ingredient in these is actually the synthetic opioids. So even though a person thinks they're using cocaine, for example, if they overdose, likely it's due to having fentanyl mixed in the cocaine. Yeah, and I've written about this, and the reason is that people haven't really got their mind around the big change that occurred. Was we used to have like an OxyContin and pain medicine problem. Once you have a heroin problem, that means that somebody other than pharmaceutical companies are making the compound, making the drug. When anytime that happens, that means instead of OxyContin being labeled with the number of milligrams, you get a bag of heroin. You get whatever they give you, and normally what they give you is a mixture, a variety of things. There even are overdoses on cannabis products that are, the way we think they're overdoses is that they're reversible by Narcan, naloxone, in the same way that a heroin overdose might be reversible. So and then the second part of your question is, do we have hope? I'm going to write about this for Addiction Hope, but just to summarize it, there's a new study from the Stanford group. That's Keith Humphrey's group. It's a very fine public health group. And they looked at the deaths and said, if we adopted all of these all the current, we improved access to medically assisted treatment, we improved access to Narcan, would we change the opioid epidemic? And it's the same analogy of what do you do when the barn's already on fire? And that is, they said it will have very limited effect. The number one intervention that would make the biggest impact would actually be widespread Narcan availability, naloxone availability, and then quickly getting people into addiction treatment. So right now, you'd have to say, well, gee, if someone chokes at a table near you, almost everybody knows how to do a Heimlich maneuver. If somebody, right, has God forbid, a heart attack, almost in every room, they scream out, and there are a number of people that have been trained and know how to do CPR. But
I know how to do CPR. I've been trained.
You see? But
yes.
As you might have seen on Addiction Hope website, if there's an overdose in an airport, nobody has Narcan. If there's an overdose at a workplace, nobody has Narcan. It's even a spray that you can spray up somebody's nose against their will, and you bring them out of an overdose. So we have to probably listen to the Surgeon General and take more personal ownership of what we can do. We can't help a person once they're deceased, and we can only help them once they're rescued. And so I think the first call is the Surgeon General's call. The more people that know how to use Narcan, the better. The second thing is your question, who do you give it to? And I say, it doesn't really matter what the person says they took or their friend says they took. It matters that they have decreased respirations or no respirations. Some evidence that before that there was drug use. It could be any drug. Doctors would look at their pupils and say they had pinpoint pupils. Doctors would count their respirations or evaluate their respirations and say they were few respirations or diminished respirations or shallow respirations. Doctors would say their pulse was thin or very low, or in some cases I've resuscitated people that had no pulse and no blood pressure or very low blood pressure. Narcan's a wonder drug, and it just kicks the opioids off of the opioid receptors that suppress respirations and breathing, heart rate, and so on, and the person just wakes up. It's a miracle, but it can't do them any good if you don't have it.
Yeah, I was shocked. Social media can be a blessing and a curse, because as a blessing, we get to be able to have this conversation right now and have people write in and get to spread so much awareness and positive messages about what people can do and how they can find help. But at the same time, it can also be a cesspool of negativity. I'm sure you're in the book somewhere helping save the world and not having to deal with social media. So maybe you don't know or don't have to deal with it. But I have been shocked after what happened with Demi Lovato and the conversation about how can we make Narcan, Noxolone, which are the same thing, by the way. It's just one is a generic term. How can we make this more accessible, as you mentioned? And people, just the negative comments about my tax dollars aren't paying for that, and we should just let these people die, and just some extremely hateful stuff that I was just shocked to read. And I'm wondering, why is there still this stigma? And then also, can you just debunk the myth that it's going to cost this tremendous amount of money and make sure this is in airports and workplaces and schools?
Probably not, because it will cost a lot of money. And
how much? Ballpark figure. Well, I mean, how much would it be? Isn't it worth it?
Of course, that's a different story. So let's just say I'm all about saving people. That's great.
Yeah.
I I'm strongly in favor and written about Narcan naloxone availability for a long time, but you can't, but it's a personal thing. So I would carry Narcan and help anyone. And I think there's so
Yeah.
many people in our country that would do it. Getting into these political or economic squabbles doesn't help me. What helps the people would be for most of us that would care for us to listen to the Surgeon General, get trained, and carry it. And you don't need much training to squirt something up somebody's nose. But so that would be my first thing. Overall, the economic arguments are challenging just because there is a lot of relapse. Many of the people who are just being rescued show up in emergency departments or in ambulances again and again, and local resources are strained, and well, treatment dollars are diverted to emergency care and emergency rooms, which isn't very effective. It is effective in saving lives, but it doesn't get you past CPR. Like, think about the analogy to a heart attack. You do CPR, and then a cardiologist comes in and says, "This, you could be this, and this." They figure out what it is, and then they treat you. In addiction, oftentimes you rescue somebody, the EMTs save their life, and then the person just goes off on their merry way. The other thing that's, I think, very tragic and misunderstood by the public is how many of the overdoses are actually suicide attempts. So
Mm.
we generally assume, the media has contributed to this, that all overdoses are accidental. But when you actually study people who have been rescued and interview them in detail, you get more of a Kurt Cobain story where they were depressed, that they needed depression treatment, and they were suicidal. Now, the head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Nora Volkow, had a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine which said about 30% of overdoses are probably suicide attempts. Whatever the number is, it's highly significant. So I think that's another factor that people need to keep in mind. But I do think it's there's it's not punishment. You can't punish an addict out of being an addict. That has been shown in research in the 1960s. They used to do like genital shock treatments. I mean,
Oh,
there were all kinds of really um, difficult to understand approaches to alcohol treatment, and that didn't prove to be effective at all. But the people who are saying this do have some support, because when the tobacco epidemic in the United States, keep in mind, almost everybody smoked. The cigarettes were 17 cents a pack. The veterans all smoked. We had 450,000 deaths a year due to tobacco. And what stopped the tobacco epidemic? And actually, it was not medically assisted treatments, even though we have patch, we had gum,
yeah.
we had all kinds of medical treatments. But really, what stopped it was people like you saying, I want clean air. I don't want to inhale somebody else's smoke. Flight attendants saying, I don't want cancer just because I'm a flight attendant. I don't want to inhale somebody else's smoke. The state government's raising taxes so that instead of it being 17 cents a pack, it's $8. I mean,
Yeah.
it was social kinds of changes and stigma. Like, I remember working in Washington, D.C., and people had to leave the building in the winter and smoke outside over the heat grates because it was too cold. And it was so in a way, this is, this is very confusing for me. I'm a big advocate of reducing stigma and increasing access to care. But at the same time, some people, professionals, have looked at the same problem and said, well, if you use the tobacco example, stigma was very helpful.
Interesting. Wow.
So,
Complex.
so like, yeah, Yeah, so when I hear like people on both sides, I try to listen because these are not facts. We're learning the facts, and the idea that someone like Keith Humphreys would say that if we used existing treatments, we wouldn't dent the opioid use disorder epidemic or the opioid overdose epidemic. So when you hear that, you have to figure that thinking outside the box is going to save the day here and not something simple.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like I put your quote up on the screen there. You can't punish an addict out of being an addict. And it's very similar, I think, to people saying you can't just tell an anorexic, just eat. Why don't you just eat?
Yeah,
Because as
exactly.
doesn't or tell someone with bulimia to just stop purging or well just eat normal. What does that even
Yeah,
mean?
I know, and it just shows a lack of understanding of what are the essential features of the disease, and I
Mhm.
do think um, that's a failure of just common education as
Yeah.
well as just trying to approach the problem from where the person is rather than where you want them to be.
Amen. What a great point to end on. You know, and this has been so great. And you know, one of the cool things about Dr. Gold is you can tell he probably about 50 studies in the past 45 minutes that we have been on here, and he is a voracious consumer of the latest research in both eating disorders and addiction. And we are going to have you back on to talk about, because we were going to do your top 5 because you've been reviewing some really, really interesting eating disorder related research articles. But we are pretty much out of time and want to respect your time as well as our viewers. So I want to say you're going to join us back so we can go through your top 5, or we can do a top 10 most fascinating eating disorder research studies, right? That you love.
That's nice of you. I'll try to post something. I'll
Yeah,
like put it together, and then when that's up, it'll be easy for everybody on the site to read, and then they'll have more chance to comment than they do if I'm just talking.
perfect. That'll be great. We'll get an article up on eating disorder hope and addiction hope, and then we can walk through kind of the most interesting pieces of this research, so that of course people who are not don't have the decades of experience as you do, we can all digest it because it's such magnificent information, and education is the key, as you mentioned. So, Dr. Gold, you rock. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. It's fun doing this, and again, thanks for letting me out of the lab.
Yeah, our pleasure. Anytime, anytime. Cool. Well, I'm going to say goodbye to Dr. Gold, and then I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone
Okay.
here on the broadcast. So thank you so much, Dr. Gold.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much. As you can tell, he just had so much information. The guy's brilliant and very honored. So be on the lookout for some of those articles about some of the latest research in the eating disorder field, especially as it pertains to co-occurring disorders. We will have Dr. Gold back on to talk about all of that and break down some of that research for us. So thank you for tuning in. Again, Kirsten here, and my nugget has been sitting on my lap with me the whole time. She says, ciao. Hope you have a beautiful, blessed week wherever you are in the world watching. And we will be back with another episode of Weekly Hope next Wednesday. So stay tuned for our next guest and time. And wherever you are, I just think, I always try to wrap up with a little thought about, regarding what we talked about. And there was so much heavy science information there, which I think is so amazing. But one of the things that I just want to emphasize from hearing Dr. Gold is, he has all the facts and he has all the research. But at the end, when we were talking about Narcan and Noxolone, he said, at the end of the day, I want to save people's lives. And people around them who love them and support them through whatever they're going through, whether it's an eating disorder or an addiction or recovering from trauma or depression and anxiety, bipolar, no matter what life has thrown at you or your genes have given you, or a loved one, to love and support people through whatever it is that they're going through, and to make sure that they get the help and the support and the resources that they need. So that is why we're here. So if something has really touched you, or you have a friend or a loved one who needs help, please visit us at eatingdisorderhope.com or addictionhope.com, our sister site. We have obviously all of those links in the comments section, but feel free to go there and check out, download articles, download videos. All of that education is free. Those resources are free for you and your loved ones, so that no one else has to lose their life or pay the ultimate price because of addiction or an eating disorder. I believe we can create a world free from addiction and eating disorders, and that's why I do what I do, and that's why we do what we do. So, all right, thanks guys so much. Have a wonderful day, wonderful week, and we'll see you next time. All right, ciao.